Welcome to this, the third episode in my series about the Indian Sepoy Mutiny in 1857-58. Previously I've talked about how and why the rebellion broke out and the siege of Delhi. In this episode we move east, down the river Ganges, to the city of Cawnpore. It was here, in June and July 1857, that two tragic events took place that changed the tone of the war. After a 3-week siege, a British garrison surrendered, but was then massacred as they tried to embark on boats provided by the rebels. And then, with a British relief column storming towards the city, the rebel leaders ordered the execution of the surviving 200 British women and children. It became a defining moment for the British in the rebellion, and was to colour their attitude on the subcontinent for decades to come. This is the story of the Cawnpore Massacre, 1857. The revolt of 1857, or the Sepoy Mutiny, also called the Indian Mutiny, was the most serious challenge to British rule in India during the 19th century. Initially driven by soldiers or sepoys of the East India Company's army turning on their officers, it soon brought in other elements from Indian society, all intent on driving out the British, as you're going to find out in this episode. And in fairness, these disparate groups didn't have a unified plan or goal other than to kick out the British, which ultimately proved their undoing. And the revolt did not engulf the whole of the subcontinent. If it had, it probably would have been game over for the British. Nevertheless, for a time, especially in northern India, the British were in serious trouble. Which brings us to the events in the city of Cawnpore, on the banks of the river Ganges. Here in 1857, the Bengal Army garrison was under the command of veteran officer Major General Sir Hugh Wheeler. Born in Ireland back in 1789, he had joined the East India Company's army in 1805 and so had had over 50 years' service with them. In many respects, he was the last of a dying breed of British officer in India. A man who saw India as his home. He spoke several local languages. He was loved by his men, whom he led into battle on countless occasions. What really set him apart was that he had an Anglo-Indian or Eurasian wife and had fathered mixed-race children. Now, back in the day, this going native had been common amongst East India Company officers. However, as the 19th century rolled on, a more aloof attitude, which we tend to associate with the Victorian British Empire, had started to be adopted. A lot of it had to do with the arrival of more and more British women on the lookout for husbands. Proportionately, officers in the Indian Army were better paid than their counterparts in the British Army, and the lifestyle was considerably cheaper. So these young officers were a bit of a catch for women who wanted to climb the Victorian social ladder and live a lifestyle that they possibly couldn't afford back in Britain. Passenger ships sailing east attracted more and more of these women and became known as the fishing fleet. The arrival of these women, influenced by the evangelical Christianity sweeping Britain at the time and also protective of their catches, subtly changed the dynamics of European interactions with locals in India. Far from being encouraged, relationships between the two communities were frowned upon, and separate European settlements became a permanent feature in Indian towns and cities, like Cawnpore. Thus the commander of the garrison at Cawnpore found himself in a difficult position. He had a position of power, but he, and more particularly his wife, were shunned by many of the European community. Indeed, there were households who would not invite the commander and his wife to dinner. This estrangement was synonymous of how relations between the British and Indians had been growing apart prior to 1857. In my first talk, I mentioned that not only had the two communities started to drift apart, but, more worryingly, so had the relationship between the British officers and their Indian troops too. The bonds that had held the East Indian Army together were fraying. Situated on the banks of the river Ganges, about 250 miles southeast of Delhi, Cawnpore was an important military and civilian centre for British rule in the recently annexed kingdom of Oudh. The problem for the British community is that whilst there was a sizable military garrison in Cawnpore, it was almost exclusively made up of Indian regiments, the 1st, 53rd and 56th Bengal Native Infantry, and the 2nd Light Cavalry. And apart from those regiments' British officers, the only men General Wheeler could really rely on were about 60 European artillerymen. In mid-May, news arrived of the Sepoy Mutiny at Meerut. Now, as you'll recall from my previous episodes, the garrison at Meerut marched on and then captured the city of Delhi. Through May, the mutiny spread across the north of India, and tensions started to mount in Cawnpore. Wheeler was mightily relieved when a detachment of 55 men from the British 32nd Regiment of Foot arrived. They were followed by 70 men from the 84th Regiment at the end of May. With no immediate signs of the mutiny amongst his Indian garrison, Wheeler sent half of the 32nd back to help out at Lucknow. Part of Wheeler's misplaced optimism was that he was promised support from a local Indian prince. Nana Sahib was the adopted son and heir of the last Peshwa or ruler of the mighty Maratha Confederation. At its peak, the Marathas ruled over a sizable portion of India. However, a series of disastrous wars with the British East India Company had resulted in their last ruler being banished to Bithur on the banks of the Ganges. Here, in a form of internal exile not far from Cawnpore, he lived out his days on a generous British pension, finally dying in 1851. He was succeeded by his adopted son, Nana Sahib. But there was a problem. The British refused to recognise an adopted son as a rightful heir, and therefore drastically reduced the pension that had previously gone to his father. Nana Sahib seethed at his treatment. Not that the British spotted it. To all intents and purposes, he remained on friendly terms with both Wheeler and also the local British civil servant or collector by the name of Charles Hillersdon. As tensions across the region continued to rise through May and into June, Hillersdon trusted Nana Sahib enough to ask for his military assistance. Would he be so kind as to bring his 300-strong private army to Cawnpore and garrison the magazine and the treasury on behalf of the British? This would enable the British to concentrate their limited forces at the barracks. Nana Sahib was only too willing to oblige and sent his men under his trusted commander, Jwala Prasad, to secure these two vital positions in the town. On the morning of the 5th of June, 1857, 3 pistol shots rang out in the barracks of the 2nd Light Cavalry. It was the signal for the rising to begin. Looting and burning their post, the cavalrymen sent messengers to the 1st Bengal Native Infantry to join them. The 1st's British commander, Colonel John Ewart, rode forward urging his men to ignore the request. Instead, they ran straight past him and joined the revolt. Many, including officers at the time, believed that Wheeler made a significant blunder in leaving the magazine and establishing himself at the barracks instead. And at first glance, the magazine, with its ammunition, its thick walls and its proximity to the Ganges, seemed a much better position. Wheeler, however, believed that if the sepoys did mutiny, they would follow the example of the men at Meerut and elsewhere in the region and march immediately for Delhi. So all he needed was a fortification to which Europeans could flee in the short term, not a position that could withstand a siege. And initially, it looked like he'd made the right call. The 4 regiments did indeed start on the road to Delhi. But then things all started to go wrong. And when I say things, I mean Nana Sahib now decided to take his revenge on the British. The mutineers had camped overnight less than 10 miles from Cawnpore, and the next morning, before they could head off towards Delhi, Nana Sahib arrived on an elephant, and he urged them to return to Cawnpore and wipe out General Wheeler's command. With a promise of a pay rise and food, the troops started to sway. Then the leader of the 2nd Light Cavalry, Subadar Tika Singh, hailed Nana Sahib as the new Peshwa of the Marathan Confederacy and persuaded the troops to do an about turn. That day, the 6th of June, General Wheeler received a letter from Nana Sahib informing him, very politely, that he was about to attack. The siege of Cawnpore was to last for 3 weeks in the heat of the Indian summer. Wheeler's entrenched position was manned by 210 soldiers, of whom 70 were convalescing from disease, and 20 local sepoys. Also in the compound were about 100 civilian men, mainly European but some Anglo-Indians included, and somewhere over 335 European women and children. Again, the majority were white British, but there were a handful of Anglo-Indians, not least General Wheeler's own family. And finally, there were about 100 Indian servants who had fled to the compound with their employers. The army of Nana Sahib brought their artillery guns against Wheeler's position. Every shell that landed was accompanied by the screams of women and children as roofs and walls caved in. On the 13th of June, the Indian bombardment was so intense that at one moment a shell was hitting the compound every 8 seconds. Meanwhile, infantry positioned in buildings, some of which were only about 300 yards away, fired incessantly at the British. The 23rd of June marked the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Plassey. In that battle, the East India Company, led by Robert Clive, had achieved a victory that had cemented their control over Bengal. In my first episode in this series, I talked about how many Indians saw the 100th anniversary as an auspicious date, a date when British rule would be ended. And in episode 2, you may recall that the rebels in Delhi launched a ferocious attack on the British lines on the anniversary. And so it was here in Cawnpore too. 4,000 rebels launched an assault on Wheeler's position, but despite their numbers, they were beaten off. Yet that success couldn't hide the fact that the British position was becoming untenable. They'd lost over a third of their men killed and were running short of both food and ammunition. Their medical supplies had been destroyed by a direct hit from a rebel shell. Their only water supply, a well, had been hit by shell fire, and anyone venturing to fetch water had to run a hail of bullets. The daytime temperatures were touching 40 degrees Celsius, 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The stench from their unwashed bodies was only met by the stench from the dead lying around the barracks. On the 25th of June, Nana Sahib's senior minister, Azimullah Khan, offered Wheeler terms for surrender. If the British surrendered their guns and treasure, Nana Sahib would evacuate the garrison and civilians by boat down the Ganges. Wheeler was opposed to any deal. He had trusted Nana Sahib before. Look what had happened. Other senior officers argued that they had a duty to save the women and children. Wheeler relented, but requested that they keep their arms and 60 rounds of ammunition each. On behalf of his master, Azimullah Khan gave his word that the garrison could leave safely for the river. Wheeler was right. He shouldn't have trusted Nana Sahib or his minister. Unbeknown to the British general, 2 weeks beforehand, the rebels had already overseen a massacre of British civilians. 120 fugitives from Fatehgarh had been brought to Cawnpore. Nana Sahib's younger brother, Bala Rao, and the senior officer of the 2nd Light Cavalry, who we've already mentioned, Tika Singh, argued that they should be shown no mercy. On the 12th of June, those British civilians had been lined up in a trench and, with Rao and Singh watching, shot. And now, on the 27th of June, Wheeler led his garrison out of their fortified positions and into the tender mercies of those very same men. Wheeler, at the head of the ragged column, arrived at the banks of the Ganges. Here at Sati Chawa, or Sati Chora Gut, Nana Sahib had assembled boats for the evacuation. The Peshwa himself was nowhere to be seen, but Balu Rao was present, so was his henchman, Tatya Tope, and the commander of the Peshwa's army, Jawala Prasad. Also present were hundreds of former sepoys, members of Jawala Prasad's own army, and local townsfolk. The British embarked on the boats, and even now the strict hierarchies of Victorian society were observed as to who sat in which boat. It was 9 a.m. before the British garrison were finally all aboard. What exactly happened next is debated. Some say that in the tension and confusion an Indian fired on the British. Others say it was the other way round. Some say that Indian sailors jumped overboard having thrown charcoal onto the thatched roofs of the boats. Alternative sources say that stoves were accidentally turned over in the mayhem and set the boats ablaze. What is certain is that a firefight now erupted between the outnumbered British in their burning boats and the Indians on the shore. Interestingly, none of those senior rebel commanders seemed to try and take control of the situation, and suddenly 4 9-pound cannon appeared and fired on the boats too, suggesting that there'd always been a slightly more sinister agenda. Indians now raced into the water to attack the British. General Wheeler was killed by 1 sword slash to his neck. Finally, an order arrived from the absent Nana Sahib to cease fire and round up the survivors. Only 1 boat managed to get away, and only 4 of its passengers eventually reached safety. 2 Anglo-Indian women also managed to escape the massacre. 17-year-old Amy Horn jumped into the river and swam to some reeds, and here she met the 18-year-old daughter of General Wheeler, Margaret, who'd done the same thing. Shortly afterwards they were both captured. Margaret was taken away by a Muslim soldier from the 2nd Cavalry and never seen again. Amy was spared by a Muslim soldier on the promise that she would convert to Islam. 6 months later, she would be rescued by soldiers fighting for Sir Colin Campbell. About 60 of the remaining British men were summarily executed, and the remaining few put in prison. The women and children were moved to the Bibi Garth, or the House of the Ladies, which had been built by a British officer for his Indian mistresses, and now, ironically, British ladies and children were imprisoned there. Nana Sahib entrusted their captivity to the servant of his favourite courtesan, Husani Khanum, also known as Husani Begum. Her hostility to her new charges was extreme. Indians, seen to be even remotely kind to them, were removed and executed. Having gained his victory over the British garrison at Cawnpore, Nana Sahib now faced his next challenge, the British relief column advancing up the Grand Trunk Road in a belated attempt to rescue Wheeler. This force of 2,000 British troops, principally regulars from the British Army rapidly diverted to India, was commanded by General Henry Havelock. On the 3rd of July, Havelock was informed by spies that Cawnpore had surrendered. Unaware of the massacre at the Satichura Ghat on the Ganges, Havelock was nevertheless concerned for the plight of the garrison and its civilians. Because, unlike Wheeler when he had surrendered to Nana Sahib, Havelock was aware of the previous civilian massacre, and based upon that knowledge, he feared the worst. Despite suffering from the effects of cholera, dysentery and sunstroke, Havelock's column managed to cover 100 miles in 10 days to close in on the city. On the 10th of July, he found the road to Cawnpore blocked at Fatehpur by Nana Sahib's army under the command of Prasad, Tatya Tope and the cavalry officer Tika Singh. The Indian force of roughly 3,500 outnumbered the British 2-1. In the ensuing battle of Fatehpur, Havelock put them to flight and then continued his advance. 3 days later, he pushed aside another army led by Nana Sahib's younger and zealous brother, Bala Rao. As sepoys started to desert the city, Nana Sahib presided over a hurriedly arranged war council, and the key question, what should they do with their prisoners in the Bibi Garth? Tatya Tope advocated killing them, and he carried the council. It's not clear why Nana Sahib ordered the executions of the women and children. He could have felt a rage against the British who were already dishing out summary justice as they advanced. Or he didn't want any witnesses from the massacre at the river. Or maybe in some sort of bizarre logic, he thought that if the prisoners were dead, then there'd be no need for the British to advance any further. We just don't know. But the order was given. Gleefully, Husani Begum ordered the sepoys guarding the house to bring the prisoners outside and line them up in the road. The sepoys had the measure of Begum. They guessed what would follow next, and they refused to comply. She was forced to call Tope to the prison, where he confronted the guards. Eventually, the sepoys agreed to fire through the windows instead. They fired one round, and then hearing the shrieks of the women and the terrified crying of the children, they refused to continue. But Begum was a woman on a mission. She now turned to her lover, Savul Khan. He arrived with 4 men, 2 Muslim butchers and 2 lower caste Hindus. Armed with swords, they entered the house. For the next hour, they hacked their way through the prisoners. Khan actually broke his sword in the fury of his attack. Finally, in utter silence, the 5 blood-covered men left the building, and Begum ordered the door to be locked. The next morning, sweepers were ordered in to dispose of the bodies. Even in the early morning temperature, the smell of decomposition was overwhelming. A British prisoner, a drummer by the name of John Fitchett, was also being held in a separate room in the house, and he watched as the sweepers brought the dead bodies out and threw them down a well. The sweepers found that many women were still, despite their wounds, alive, and they brought them out, and they were killed. 3 little boys, somewhere between the ages of 4 and 7, had somehow managed to avoid the massacre. Now, traumatised and terrified, they ran around the courtyard screaming until one by one they were seized and thrown down the well, still alive. Then more adult bodies were thrown in on top to suffocate them. Eventually, the well was filled to the brim, and the remaining bodies were dumped in the Ganges. It was estimated that 200 women and children were murdered at the Bibi Garth, the House of the Ladies. The following day, 17th of July 1857, General Havelock's relief column entered the city. One of the first sights they saw was a tattered man stumbling towards them. John Shepherd was a survivor of the massacres at the river and had been imprisoned. With Havelock advancing on the city, his jailers had fled and he had escaped, and now he informed the general of the terrible events at the Satichari Ghat. If the British were horrified by that story, nothing prepared them for what they found at the Bibi Garth. The floor of the house was covered in dried blood. Torn hair and clothing littered the rooms. Tiny bloody handprints from children were on the walls. As many British probably died in the massacre on the banks of the Ganges as had been killed in the Bibi Garth, but it was the latter that made a lasting impression. It was an attack on defences, women and children. Queen Victoria, when told of the massacre, commented that such horror was unknown in these ages. Whilst not entirely true, it is importantly the first time the British had suffered such an action. And in the strict moral code of Victorian Britain, this had stepped over the line, and those responsible could expect no mercy. Troops arriving in the city were taken to the Bibi Garth, and the impression it made upon them was very deliberate. As Second Lieutenant Arthur Lang from the Bengal Engineers wrote, "Every man across the river who I meet shall suffer for my visit to Cawnpore." From now on, the war between the British and the Indian rebels took on a more brutal, more unforgiving tone. "Remember Cawnpore" became a rallying cry for the British as they sought to put down the rising. The moral indignation and retribution of the British knew no bounds. 19th century historian J.W.K. described the next months as a bloody assize through India as hanging parties dished out summary justice on anyone suspected of being a rebel. Thousands of them. And just by those numbers, many would not have been active rebels, or rebels at all. Brigadier General James Neal epitomised the desire for revenge. He ordered that rebels from the Cawnpore area be forced to clean up the Bibi Garth, some forced to lick the dried blood from the floor, before being hanged. Other rebels were executed by being strapped to the muzzles of a cannon, which were then fired, a particularly gory punishment, which incidentally had been employed previously by rulers in India's own past. The rebel leaders at Cawnpore were wanted men. Nana Sahib's army commander, Jwala Prasad, was captured and hanged in 1859 at Sati Chowra, the site of the massacre over which he'd presided. Azimullah Khan, the man who had guaranteed General Wheeler's safe conduct, supposedly died of a fever, maybe smallpox, whilst on the run, although rumours abounded that he'd somehow found his way to Constantinople. Tacha Tope was also captured and executed in 1859, but before that he has a big part to play in another episode in this series. And what of Nana Sahib, the Peshwa of the Maratha Confederacy? Well, the Confederacy was stillborn, and his title was merely that. And unlike some of the other rebel leaders, he simply seems to disappear from records. No one knows definitely where he died or when. The most persistent rumour is that he lived out his days in Nepal, but others claim he lived incognito in other parts of India. The well at Cawnpore became a shrine in colonial India. After independence, the monument was moved to the Memorial Church in the city, itself established in memory of the victims of the siege of 1857. There remains a final footnote to this bloody and sad story. It took place near the bazaar in Cawnpore in the early 1900s, nearly 50 years after the events I've described. A Catholic priest was called to a dying Anglo-Indian lady living in the Indian quarter of the town. She told him that she had survived the massacre on the banks of the Ganges. Jumping off a boat, she had hidden in some reeds, but had been found by rebel sepoys. They spared her, and she was carried away by a man from the 2nd Cavalry. His name was Ali Khan, and she'd ended up marrying him. On her deathbed, she identified herself to the priest as Margaret Wheeler, the daughter of General Wheeler. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope that you found this episode interesting. Join me next time as I explore one of the great military battles of the rebellion, the Siege of Lucknow. But until next time, thanks for your support, keep well, and I'll see you very soon.